Washington has been called, among other things, a city of Greek wedding cakes. They celebrate the conviction of the founding fathers that what they were building was the first modern republic worthy of ancient Greece. What they could not anticipate was the flood of democracy that would rough up the symmetry of their new institutions. This is the kind of contrast that constantly arises between what the 18th century hoped to make out of American life and what life turned out to be. For example, nearly all the visual records we have of the wars of the 18th century show men fighting and dying in an almost dignified and stately way. Clearly, these scenes were not photographed by network correspondents this morning to show to us tonight. Yet the 18th century wars, and not least the American War of Independence, were bloodier than most, if only because they were man-to-man, horse-to-horse, hand-to-hand affairs. But since this was the century of reason and elegance, these wars were brought to an end in reasonable treaties concluded in elegant rooms. But even with reasonable people, it takes time for the bad blood to simmer. And it took 2 years from the British surrender at Yorktown to the Peace of Paris, which ended the War of Independence. It was signed, the treaty was signed at this desk, and it was commemorated in that sketch painting by Benjamin West. Now there you see the American delegation led by Benjamin Franklin in black. You don't see the British delegation because they were so used to winning that they didn't know how to look like losers, and they refused to show up at the artist's studio. However, in those intervening 2 years, they had won great naval victories in the West Indies, and they still occupied New York, so they came to this desk with some bargaining strength. Obviously, they had to grant the total independence of the new nation called the United States of America, and they had to give up these huge lands from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico that they'd won only 20 years before from the French. That's to say, all the way from the Mississippi to the Allegheny Mountains. They did retain navigation rights on the Mississippi and a share of the Newfoundland fisheries. Well, so much for the parties of the first part, but now came the nasty stage in every peace treaty where the allies of the winner demand their pound of flesh. The French were quite content to see Britain stripped of her American empire and to leave a small nation on a huge continent which, no doubt, at some later date, would require French protection. That left the Spanish, and they wanted rewards far beyond their prowess. In fact, they wanted Gibraltar, way back then, and were persuaded by the French to settle for Florida. But now there was great anxiety over a word that haunts the defeated in every civil war, and the word is reprisal. What was going to happen to the loyalists, to the 1/3 of the colonists who'd fought on the British side, or at least supported them? Well, the treaty put in some humane promises about compensation for houses, lands, possessions, but the Congress was an infant, and it couldn't keep these promises. And I'm sorry to say that in the result, the loyalists were treated with alarming variations throughout the states. The Pennsylvania Quakers were so compassionate that a disgusted New Yorker wished instead they had followed the example of his state. There was nothing, he said, like a vigorous, manly execution. But in most places, the Loyalists had a brutal time. In many towns, the favorite torture was tarring and feathering, and this cartoon suggests that the fate of a woman collaborator is much the same in all wars. The Loyalists lost their houses and businesses. They had no legal redress from assault and slander. They even had to pay for robberies and the ruin caused by rioting mobs. And at last, they were forced into exile in great numbers, to Canada, to the West Indies, or back to England.
The day the British evacuated Charleston, 100 ships sailed down the bay, jammed with Loyalists. And in New York, the British commander was so fearful of mass reprisals that he refused to give up the port until the last refugee was aboard. And one of them made the forlorn note in his diary, "There will scarcely be a village in England without some American dust in it by the time we are all at rest." The welcome home given to starving exiles was seldom as elaborate as this symbolic reception by Britannia. But this forced exodus was, I suppose, prudent, if not inevitable.
The war had ended in a blaze of patriotism, and the people were so peacock proud that sooner or later they might have menaced the lives of a population of renegades. So for a time they reveled in the popular fiction of a brave and indissoluble alliance of new states, and they celebrated it in the naive symbols of the time: the eagle, the war horse, and Columbia with her flag.
Even so level-headed a man as John Adams wrote, "This day of July 1776 will be the memorable epoch in the history of America. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore." The conquering heroes had come home all right, drunk on the pride of sovereignty, but not as Americans, rather as Virginians, Marylanders, New Yorkers, Pennsylvanians. But on the morning after, this indissoluble union soon dissolved into separate states, slapping tariffs on each other, coining their own money, going their own ways, shucking off the huge national war debt as somebody else's business. We are here in Philadelphia because this is where 55 men came to try and repair the chaos of what had become the disunited States of America, just about held together by some loose agreements called the Articles of Confederation, a sort of League of Nations which, like some others, kept boasting about an overriding authority which, in fact, it never possessed. So, in time, influential men in the new states came to recognize with much reluctance that they were not a nation. And they came here in 1787 to Philadelphia, frankly, to see if they could make the government work. It was natural for them to come here. Philadelphia was the great metropolis of colonial America. It was the central city. It was here, in its State House, now called Independence Hall, that the Declaration of Independence had been passed in 1776. And it was here that George Washington had received the command of the Continental Army. This is the chamber in which they met, and it looks very much as it did then. There was no argument about who their presiding officer was to be. George Washington sat and occasionally slept here. The other delegates sat around these tables, one table to one state. I said just now that they were reluctant to come together here. They were big men in their own country, and I suppose they hated to lose the sweet smell of success that they'd enjoyed in their own bailiwicks. Anyway, it took 10 days to get a quorum, and Rhode Island never did show up. Rhode Island is in the Union, though. But when 7 states were represented, they closed the doors and they began. But who were they? The Declaration of Independence had started its catalogue of royal crimes with the grand phrase, "We the people." But by any definition of the people that we'd accept, they were not here. You know, looking back on it now, it's awfully hard for us to realize that the men who created the United States were not creating our society. They would have shuddered at some of our deepest beliefs, democracy, for instance. For though the king had gone and the governors were appointed by men of property and the legislatures were elected, I think that most of the men who came here would have agreed with old John Winthrop that democracy amongst civil nations is accounted the meanest and worst form of government. Also, they had no intention of sanctioning political parties. They agreed with their chairman, George Washington, that political parties provoke the mischief of associations and combinations. Now, it's natural to ask, how about the people's people, the demagogues, the bloodshot orators who had rabble-roused the country into revolution? Patrick Henry, Tom Paine. They weren't here. For it often happens that men who love the bonfire find the rebuilding something of a bore. Patrick Henry refused to come. He said, "I smell a rat in Philadelphia." Tom Paine was a man so exhilarated by agitation that he adopted it as a profession. The very month the founding fathers gathered in Philadelphia, he sailed away to try and pull England into revolutionary shape. He was arrested in London for treason. He escaped to France to play first trumpet to the French Revolution. But he found they had their own trumpeters, and he missed the guillotine by a hair's breadth. It should be a lesson to all columnists and writers of indignant books. So who then were the men who were to be known ever afterwards as the Founding Fathers? Jefferson called them an assembly of demigods. Not quite. But they were a superior lot, possibly the most enlightened, certainly the most civilized revolutionaries the world has seen in the last 200 years. These 55 men were the elite of business, the professions, and government in their own states, the shippers and manufacturers of the North, the planters and scholars of the South. More than half of them were lawyers. 29 of them were graduates of colleges of either Britain or America. Average age, 42, which in the 18th century was just a little beyond the span of normal life. Well, they were here for just under 17 weeks, and the first thing they did was to flout their instructions. They decided that the Articles of Confederation were hopeless. They abolished them and started from scratch, and they sat down here to invent a nation. They spent the first 2 months looking through all the ancient and modern forms of government and found, Franklin said, only the seeds of their dissolution. So they began by deciding what they wouldn't have. A parliamentary system, for instance. Out. They had 150 years tradition of separate governments for the states, and they meant to keep them. And since they'd overthrown what they'd come to look on as the tyranny of monarchy, they wouldn't have a king, and they wouldn't have a standing army. Kings could command standing armies and manipulate parliaments. A professional army was anathema to them. Indeed, the Continental Army was disbanded within 6 months of the end of the war, and the Navy and the Marine Corps ceased to exist. When, by the way, the suggestion came from an old army man who idolized his chief, that George Washington should be made king, Washington himself was the first to snuff it out as an idea I must view with abhorrence and reprehend with severity. Oh, at the start, they took a decision that today would certainly produce the most frightful hullabaloo among the newspapers and the networks, not to mention the people. Should they publish their debates as they went along? It's a problem that has pestered diplomats ever since, whether, as Woodrow Wilson believed, such conferences should seek open covenants openly arrived at, or, as Dag Hammarskjöld believed, they should seek open covenants secretly arrived at. Well, they agreed with Dag Hammarskjöld, and Washington said that even if they didn't publish their debates and their resolutions dribbled out, they would get into the newspapers and, he said, disturb the public repose with premature speculations. Imagine. So, what was recorded here and what went on behind these closed doors was unknown to anybody on the outside for 60 years. When the convention was all over and Benjamin Franklin was going through these doors for the last time, an old lady stopped him and said, "Well, doctor, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy?" And he replied, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." Well, the Republic has been kept for 200 years, but not without considerable disturbance to the public repose. George Washington, thou shouldst be living at this hour. This is not a rock rally, but a 1970 political campaign. One man's way of trying to get elected to the United States Senate.
Senator How are you? Wonderful. Glad you could come out.
Good to see you tonight.
How are you? Fine.
How are you, sir? Very nice to meet you. One way can we locate? Need your help, sir.
We're going to go one way to go.
Need your help. You'll better need your help.
How are you?
This, too, is going on in the founder's town of Philadelphia. That is probably the 15th ice cream cone that he's had to take a lick at in one day.
The next United States senator who will talk to the people of Pennsylvania. Where do we get the money from, folks? Ask yourself that. We run the Senate of the United States with the conviction and the knowledge that we serve no one except the people. I've made public my expenditures.
But back in Independence Hall in 1787, the great debate turned on a crucial question: the balance of power between the central government and the states. There was one brilliant advocate of a strong central government, Alexander Hamilton. Like most fervent nationalists, like Napoleon, like Hitler, Hamilton was born elsewhere. He was a British subject born in the West Indies. At the age of 12, he was running a mercantile business in St. Croix and doing it expertly in 2 languages. At 16, he entered what is now Columbia University, and he wrote some of the most persuasive of the revolutionary pamphlets. He fought bravely in the war, and at the end of it was a military aide to George Washington. He was the supreme spokesman of the aristocratic principle. He wanted a lifetime president, a lifetime Senate recruited exclusively from men of property, an all-powerful central government that could absolutely veto the laws of the states. At the opposite pole was a Virginian, George Mason, who argued to the end for strong individual rights, a weak central government, and equal powers for the states. In between Hamilton and Mason sat a most undramatic figure, 32 years old, a theologian of great learning, more patience, and a skeptical view of human nature,
James Madison. If men were virtuous, he once reminded the convention, there would be no need of governments at all. This was our man in the middle, James Madison. His great learning, these tomes, remind me of a story about a very practical British Prime Minister who was asked how Harold Laski, another great scholar of politics, how he'd made out when he was given his first political job. And Mr. Attlee said, rum thing about Harold, never got the hang of it. Well, the truly marvelous thing about Madison was the way he got the hang of it, was the way his learning and his experience reinforced each other. He came to Philadelphia with this vast pile of books, and he lectured the delegates on the history of confederacies, ancient and modern. And from it, he hammered home a warning that no confederacy had ever succeeded which set up a conflict between the national and the provincial government. So bluntly you could say he thought both Hamilton and Mason were wrong. His idea, which really became the central principle of the American system, was that the national government does not exist to coerce the states or be their rival. They both exist for the protection of the American citizen. And happily, the men of Philadelphia hearkened to him. So they boosted the pride of the little states by giving them equal representation in an upper house and giving every locality the widest representation in a lower house. And this was the vital compromise, they agreed to recognize and respect the variety of life and tradition in the states, and to give them and leave them to this day great independent powers. This is not any building in Washington. It is the entrance to a state capitol, the headquarters of government by and for that state alone. And there's some such building in each of the 50 states. Each has its governor, its executive branch, and its own Congress with an upper house and a lower house. In 50 state capitals, men are busy exercising all the powers which the Constitution did not give to the federal government. The states control their own highways, education, banking, divorce, taxation, even their own civil and criminal codes. It was a daring thing to give these powers to the states, but it greatly diffused the opportunity for self-government, and, we ought to say, for corruption. It sounds like a shattering defeat for Alexander Hamilton, and so it was. When the Constitutional Convention was over, he said, "No man's ideas are more remote from the plan than my own are known to be." Now, I said that he was a Roman, and he had some of the Roman vices, arrogance, centralism, but he had a great Roman virtue, magnanimity. He never complained or recriminated because he'd lost. And to me, Alexander Hamilton, not a very fashionable figure now, represents the politician at his very best, showing an absence of malice, a steady willingness to believe that your opponent is as honorable a man as you are, and may be right. He swallowed his most passionate convictions and wrote more than 40 brilliant essays urging the states to ratify the Constitution, which was a very close thing in some places. In Virginia, for instance, they voted 89 for, 79 against. George Mason and Patrick Henry voted against. But in the end, it was done. And I think, thanks mainly to these three men, to Hamilton, Mason, and Madison, they together achieved the triumph of three principles which I believe have sustained this federal republic on a continent for so long. They're undramatic principles, but they're very precious. They are compromise, compromise, compromise.